Thank you so much for tuning in to the Nerds and Jesus podcast. Welcome. My name is Mary Howell. I'm a Christian and a worship leader who happens to also be a huge nerd, according to myself, all my friends, family, and coworkers. And recently, I've been wanting to discuss how Christian nerds are to navigate living in the secular world, how we are to be a light in the darkness while also nerding out on all types of fandoms pop culture has to offer. Today, we will be discussing if we as a society become obsessed with the idea of a faraway kingdom because we dream of another place other than our reality. But I'm not on this podcast alone, as I am joined this week by worship leader, doodle owner, and nerd Annie Mayberry, and also joined by friend, data protection engineer, nerd, and cold plunge connoisseur Kerrigan Clark. Kerrigan and Annie, how's it going?
Hey.
How you doing,
Mary?
for having us, Mary?
I'm glad you guys are on here. I know, have y'all done I think y'all haven't done a podcast, I believe, or an episode like this?
Not like this. I've done one, other one with you, Mary, actually.
I know.
Yeah.
No, this is my first time.
Yeah. Well, sweet. I'm glad you guys are on this episode. I know whenever we were all in El Salvador and we were discussing the potential of recording this episode. So I'm glad we finally got to do that. So there's two questions I always ask my guests. For the very first question is like, how long have y'all been a Christian? And you're welcome to share a little bit of your story. So whoever wants to go first.
Annie, you go for it.
Okay, I'll do it. So I have been in church my whole life. I was one of those kids who got saved at like 5 years old next to my bed, praying with my mom. But really my faith kind of became my own in my teen years. So my youth group was like really pivotal in that. And I went to all the summer camps and I was one of those kids who was like there every time the doors were open. So, you know, my testimony has been varied since then, and God has brought me through some really tough days into some really good and sweet days now. So I've been following him pretty much my whole life, and I'm, you know, he's made such a huge difference in me and who I am and what I am excited to continue to do for him. So
yay. Sweet. Thanks for sharing. Yeah.
So I was actually trying to get a date on this recently, and I've got my baptism card. I can't find it, but when I do, I'll know the exact date. But I think I came back to faith about 3.5 or 4 years ago. I grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor when I was a kid. After they divorced, both my parents kind of stepped away from faith. And as a result, we did too. We still kind of went to church every so often when it was, you know, convenient and when it made sense. So I ended up going down a pretty tough path in my teenage years. In fact, it's, you know, funny we're talking about fantasy today and faraway kingdom, because the first real escape that I found from kind of a broken and shattered reality was fantasy. That was like my big reprieve. And then, you know, later coupled with addiction was kind of a step further into a different reality than my own. And God pulled me out of my addiction and led me on a path of recovery. And you know, I explored a lot of religions. I wanted to come back and get all the questions answered. And, you know, Christianity was one of those religions that I could ask a lot of questions and get a lot of answers. And I just found truth in apologetics and, you know, the history of the faith. So, been here ever since, definitely sold on the truth, and been walking with Jesus pretty closely for the past couple of years.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for sharing, guys. So next question is, how big of a nerd are you? And if you can choose your top fandom or game or something that's just like your niche, what would that be?
What's the scale? Like, is it like a sliding scale rating like system that we should know about?
I mean, it could be
1 to 10. 1 to
10, I guess.
10. Okay. We're just going to say 1 to 10.
Yeah.
I'm probably like, I don't know, maybe a 4. Like if 10 is the highest. I kind of tiptoe in that direction, but I'm not like a full on head over heels.
Mary.
Mary. Yeah. I was going to say it, but I wanted you to have the chance. Yeah. So I'm probably like a 4. Oh gosh, probably my biggest fandom is Marvel, I would say, for sure. Specifically, Guardians of the Galaxy are just my all-time faves, always. Yeah.
I know, this last movie.
Interesting.
It was so good.
I didn't expect that, Annie.
Yeah?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
She gave me her Marvel t-shirt because she had a Marvel t-shirt one time. It was great.
Yep. Yep.
Sweet.
You're welcome.
Kerrigan.
So for me, golly, so the scale varies for sure, depending on the year. I think my relationship with fantasy is complicated, and especially, what I'm interested in and what I'm into. The reason I say that is because I can take it just way too far, and I've got to be really balanced. But for me, it's always been books. It hasn't really been like a series, or I do like Marvel. I love Harry Potter, like Lord of the Rings. But I've read hundreds of medieval fiction books. So that's kind of my niche is medieval fiction, wizards, dragons, some overlooked protagonist kid that grows up to be, the chosen warrior, those sort of stories. I've read so many books that like they overlap with one another. I can't even always recall. But I think my favorite series that I'm actually midway through his second series of books, Brandon Sanderson, The Way of Kings, the Mistborn series, of course, the Inheritance Cycle. Those are probably my top fandoms.
Yeah, we talked about the Inheritance Cycle a couple episodes ago. I did not know what that meant until Aragon series. I understand now.
Aragon. I actually listened to a clip and somebody dogged on the movie, and I'm like, I'm glad somebody called it out because that movie was just trash. Total disservice to the book series.
Yeah. What would you say is like your top fantasy book that you've read?
Jonathan Renshaw wrote a book called Dawn of Wonder, and it's only one book, so he's got two more coming out. And it's the best book nobody's ever heard of because he's not a really well-known author. Aragon was my number one for many years. The only book I've ever read twice, which is kind of weird. I just like new stories. I don't know why I have a hard time reading the same book twice. But Dawn of Wonder, I can't remember how many pages it was. It might have been like 800 to 1,000. I think I cleaned that out in like a week and a half. Like I just couldn't put the book down. It was so good. So I check his website maybe once every other week, just seeing if it's the next book is released. So definitely my favorite.
Sweet. So, I mean, speaking of fantasy, that's kind of the reason why we're all here together today, is, as a society, we do we become obsessed with the idea of a faraway kingdom because we dream of another place other than our reality? And so, I feel like that's a big question. So how would y'all, if y'all can define, I guess, fantasy in your own words, how would y'all define that?
I'd be interested to hear your take on that first, Kerrigan.
Okay. So like I said, like me and fantasy have a really complicated relationship. So I guess in order to answer that question, I kind of have to tell a bit of a story with my relationship with fantasy. So when everything was kind of just, hitting the fan in my life and my parents divorced, I think the first fantasy book that I picked up was like Goosebumps. And that's kind of where I started it was an introduction because we didn't watch TV growing up. We watched VeggieTales, but we were never really introduced to the world of fantasy or anything like that. And, when things were kind of dark in my life, I picked up this book and I was just able to escape into an entirely new reality with different characters, different outcomes. And it was a predictable story plot and it made sense and justice was served. And I don't know if that's actually relevant to Goosebumps or not, but that started my relationship with fantasy was, justice and, these new levels of power and just so many cool new concepts. And I had an acute ability to read for 8 to 10 hours out of a day. I mean, I would be thirsty and hungry and just wouldn't put the book down. Like I wouldn't even notice. I would just be so engulfed in this story. And so, later, I mentioned earlier that, I found drugs to kind of enhance this world of fantasy and escapism, coupled with video games, and it just took me out of reality. But I've always said that fantasy, to an extent, was kind of my first drug. It was my first high that I had felt to escape reality. And later I started to, I guess, find a healthier balance and a healthier relationship with fantasy. So I do have to restrict myself. And there's certain video games I cannot play World of Warcraft. I simply can't do it. I'll disappear for weekends and days at a time. It's a big disservice for me. So I think fantasy, with restrictions and boundaries and in moderation, can be, I guess, a really a beautiful way to use the imagination that God's given us to create stories. And I think we use that same level of imagination when we read the gospel, and he talks about a kingdom and a heaven, and he prepares a place for us. And he doesn't tell us exactly what that's going to look and feel like, but we get to use our imagination to think of that. And I have a lot more on fantasy, but I'm sure we'll break down more of that throughout the conversation. But I guess today I don't have any fine conclusions as to exactly how to moderate it. I'm still a work in progress when it comes to fantasy and escapism.
Yeah. There's a really good article. It's by Geeks Under Grace published it. It's called Why Christians Should Read Fantasy by Thomas White. And so I was actually reading it this morning, and I'm like, man, I should have sent this to y'all so you can read it. It's so good. But I'll post this on our social media for those of y'all who follow us on social media. But it kind of goes through even just the history of, between fantasy and just the church and Christianity, just because it's always been so controversial. I think for a couple of years, and even with the rising, popularity of like D&D and kind of going into that world, there was especially with even, Harry Potter coming up and other books like that, there's always that line that people are learning how to draw, because there's such thing as dark fantasy, and there's like that lighthearted fantasy that we see in like Chronicles of Narnia. And so it's almost looking at both of them, because even within fantasy, you can't really escape like mythology, and that's engraved within fantasy many of the times. And so a lot of times you're learning about like all these other types of gods within this fantasy realm, this world. And so it's really interesting between that. So how have y'all seen, just really with your experience with fantasy, or even Andy, really answering that question for you too, like how have you seen that, like in your walk with God, and how do you balance both?
No, I think that's a really, really good kind of line to walk of appreciating fantasy for what it can do to build our imagination, to build our faith in a lot of ways, while also not getting so caught up in it, so lost that it becomes a place that we turn instead of turning to God. Because the moment that we're escaping to this place of fantasy instead of turning to the Lord for comfort or peace or whatever it may be that we need, that's when these things become dangerous. And I think, Kerrigan, it's really interesting that you called it like fantasy was kind of your first drug, because realistically, I think that's the case, for a lot of people. And especially if you're coupling fantasy with like other potential addictions, whether that be like food, like you're binging some show and binging food at the same time, or you are it's pornography that's fantasy related. It is a gateway to many, many other things. And so I think as believers, it's a really, really fine line for us to walk, exactly like we're saying, of like, yes, there are ways that can point us to the kingdom, but also I would err on the side of saying there are more ways that it can point us away from the kingdom. And so it has to be approached with like serious care and knowledge before you're getting into some of these things, of like doing your research, talking to friends who have read this series or watched this series or done whatever, to say like, do you feel like this is safe? And really, really putting in the work on the front end before it's like you're already to this point of addiction of like, I got to turn the page, I got to watch the next episode. Really having that toolkit to say, no, I need to stop before I start on this one.
Yeah, I feel like even my history with fantasy, I think it for probably every child always begins, from what you watched when you were a kid, even to the smallest thing as like a Disney movie. It sparks that, because what's interesting, this is kind of like what this even article really shares, like all of the roots in like in ancient mythology that we see. It's well known that Beowulf was the primary inspiration for Lord of the Rings, and Grimm's fairy tales was inspiration for a large number of Disney classics. And so a lot of those are more of the darker of the folk tales of ancient Nordic and Germanic peoples. And so we see those stories being interwoven in like what we are normally exposed to in fantasy today. And so which is, I feel like a lot of the Disney films are just like that introduction for, I think, many kids, or many of us, who really kind of, it grew from there, like, oh wait, what is this world of an ancient, like, or a faraway kingdom of, there's always, just especially, I mean, as girls, even like the Disney princesses, that's sparks a lot. Really, where it started for me was all the Disney princesses. I loved Little Mermaid, to everything. I'm excited about I have mixed emotions about Little Mermaid coming up, but I'm still excited to see it, and so it really sparks kind of everything, and it even starts that longing for that world. Like, oh man, it's just the happily ever after, or the fantasy of that world, and diving into that. And so I think even for those who are not maybe huge nerd, maybe someone's listening, like, I'm not a huge nerd, I don't play D&D, I don't, watch Lord of the Rings, but all that fantasy is engraved into like everyday even shows that we watch.
Exposed. Everyone has a starting
Everyone's
point.
been exposed.
And I think what's interesting, like, you mentioned Marvel and Disney and all these shows, like Jordan Peterson actually brought up a really cool concept that we are all going to view our life through the lens of a story. Some story is being told in our life, and the way that we're influenced, especially when we're younger, can set the trend of that story. And for a lot of girls, like you mentioned, it's a princess hidden away and locked away in a tower and waiting on their prince.
The damsel in distress.
Waiting on their Prince Charming, and overlooking the rest of life. And for men, it's, the Harry Potter tucked away in a closet, or it's the overlooked protagonist. And in some of those stories, admittedly, one of my biggest struggles was I had a false sense of self-importance, that these stories were influencing the way that I perceived my world. And I was the protagonist in the story, and there was going to be a coming of age for me, and the light would shine upon me in the driveway, and this is the chosen one, like, and now I can look at it and laugh. But like when you're a kid, you don't know the difference. You're viewing your life through the story. And I think as Christians, it's so important for us. And it's also a relief to know that we already have a story we can view the world through. We don't have to rely on big media companies to determine how we perceive the world. We've got the books of the Bible to point us to the story that we're living in, and it's his story, and it's so much better than ones that we can create.
I'm glad that you brought up Disney movies, Mary, because I never really thought about that connection, but that was such a part of my childhood, and especially the princesses. Of course, we all love them. But I think some of the narratives, Kerrigan, you're talking about kind of the narrative that gave you as a child. I think some of the narratives that like I receive from that, and like many girls receive from that, is not just around like, oh, I'm this damsel in distress, I need rescue, but it also sets up significantly unrealistic expectations about romantic relationships and what is supposed to transpire within them and how they're supposed to come about. And it's these things that seem relatively innocent while your daughter is watching such and such a show, but just can't know the impact entirely until you're an adult or entering teendom, and you're like, okay, this is how this is supposed to go. Why is this guy not treating me this way? Why is this not happening how I thought that it would be happening? And so it's like,
you mean it's not happily ever after?
What? Right? Not every time? What? No. Yeah. And so I think that we're kind of like, I'm on the like maybe probably the front end of the generation who really kind of deals with that, honestly. And I'm hoping that like as my generation, our parents, that we are a little bit more careful about really protecting the narratives that we are exposing our children to. And I'm not in like a helicopter parent creepy kind of way, of course, but I mean, if you watch a Disney princess, have a discussion with your daughter about, hey, these are some things that are reality, And these are some things that are fantasy. And I think that that's something that that can help kids, like as we guide children as they're consuming fantasy, to have these discussions around like, hey, let's talk about this. Like, what here is realistic in the real world and is actually going to happen in your life, and what is pretend? And like, let's separate those things from an early age so that you have this framework to build upon as you continue to consume this, you know?
And even like, it's all always in books as well, you know. Like I remember like reading the Percy Jackson series when I was like in middle school, high school, and I was, you know, I grew up in the church, but I remember like I took it was a long time of me just, it was fine learning about it, but I got so deep into like learning about Greek mythology of like that just entrenched my world, because I was binge reading these books, you know, as the books came out, I was waiting for the next one to come out and so forth and so forth. And so I remember at a time I was like, I really haven't, you know, I didn't really read the word during that time or whatever, you know, but I was a kid, you know, I was entrenched in this world. And so it's interesting. And even, you know, obviously we talk about that. I talked about it in this last episode of, we had a Harry Potter episode, but, you know, majority of fantasy will also, you know, deal with magic. Magic's a part of those kingdoms and fantasy. And so we see, you know, that good magic and evil magic and stuff like that as well. And I think as adults, you know, we, at least as like adult Christians, we recognize, okay, magic, that kind of magic may not exist entirely, you know, in this world. But as a kid, you know, that's all that you're wanting, really. And your focus goes into, I don't know, that's kind of like a lot of my experiences, like growing up with that and seeing both sides of it within even Harry Potter.
I think that like part of one of the reasons, Kerrigan, you kind of alluded to this, but why we all are drawn to fantasy, especially as children, is that it does paint such a clear picture so often of like good and evil and the battle and the struggle between those and the victory of evil in that. And so in some ways, I think it's like it can be a positive archetype for us to understand as children, like this is how this is supposed to look. But I think, again, it has to be like within the confines of like good discussions around this is reality. This is not reality, you know? And something that keeps coming to mind for me is a series I hadn't thought about to mention earlier, but the Wingfeather Saga by Andrew Peterson was I listened to those. He did the readings himself, and they're just beautiful. They feel very much to me like a modern day kind of Chronicles of Narnia, but with a little more whimsy and fun. But they are like a perfect introduction to this beautiful fantasy world that he creates, but it also points to entirely to the archetype of Christ while using these analogies all through it to still have that underdog protagonist that we all want to see come to victory, and like characters that we can relate with and things like that. So I say that to say that we are not without these options. Like they're harder to find. They're harder to, like, you have to dig in and say, okay, I'm going to actually do the research and find this series that is like Christ focused, though whether it says his name or not, I know this author has him in mind as he's doing this.
C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, you know, you see all that.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like Wingfeather Saga is just a good example that I wanted to throw in of like, that's a modern day take on that. So good.
Yeah. And I even wonder, you know, even as teenagers or as you're growing up, young adult, obviously it becomes a form of escapism, fantasy. We talk about that. And there's an extent of escapism where you have to really pull the reins back, you know, but there's been the argument, you know, of maybe a little bit of escapism is good sometimes, you know, and so it's finding that balance of that line. And, you know, we find maybe just a lot of folks who go into these fantasy worlds and dive deeper into it and maybe become obsessed to the point where that's all you think about, or the world that you just so deeply wish that you can be a part of. And that's honestly, that's probably, I don't think y'all have been to any kind of Comic-Con conventions yet, or I say yet because I'm going to take y'all one day. But there's that next level to where you become so focused and entrenched like in this fantasy world that you become that character that you want to be, and you go into these conventions, and there are people who, it's not exactly LARPing, but you are completely that character, and like they won't change character. Like that is who they are for that day. And so there's also those, just want to dress up and have fun, you don't really think much about it. That's usually how around the route that I go. But I've seen just how far people can go of like, this is, or even making it their career of like, I am this person. I don't know if you've seen on social media, like there are people who will cosplay as one person and that's their whole social media account. And that is how they make their, whether that's on TikTok, on Instagram, whatever. I mean, that is their character. Like that is how they're making money, is by becoming this character, making videos dressed as that character. And it could be all fun and games until like that's your whole identity for the most part. And so it's escaping into that fantasy, but going further. But another part of that question though, too, is like, we desire to see that good versus evil and for good to win. And like, I think that's why so many of us are drawn to a bunch of fantasy, but even a lot of fantasy can convey like biblical truths, and so to the unchurched and to the church. And we see that, through C.S. Lewis, and even through, Tolkien's stories of just how beautifully they're written. And they might not, kind of like we were saying, Annie, not exactly will say, hey, this represents Jesus, this represents the Israelites, or this represents God, and so, but there's this, so I have a Hobbit devotional. That's what it's called. And it's fantastic. And it's pretty great.
I love that.
Someone made it. My friend's borrowing it right now. It is so great because it'll go through every chapter and coincide with the actual Hobbit. And so it'll have a devotional on like, they'll talk about the storyline, and also show like the hobbits, as Israelites, kind of comfortable and comfort, like where they are, not wanting to go out and do something until one's called, like it's this whole, it's so great how I have to send that link to y'all. But I don't know. And for that reason, for those who love fantasy and go into Lord of the Rings, or maybe not Lord of the Rings, maybe you might find that one, series that you can really relate to, or just see God's goodness through it, because everything can be also made for him too. So,
and a lot of, we like the creators and writers of everything that we've mentioned, a lot of the time follow what they know. And like, you can see the archetypes from the Bible in these characters. Like I was watching the Avengers, and Iron Man, for example, I think he kind of carries a more messianic archetype, to where he's constantly the first one to be like, yeah, I know I might die doing it, but I got to do it, and over and over again, in every movie he's in, he puts himself in a position where he could die to save the greater good. And then eventually, he gets what he wants. And it's kind of that messianic archetype. The difference with somebody like Iron Man is he had kind of a guilt complex, and it drove him to want to, do something good with his life. So he was kind of driven by guilt. But I mean, these archetypes also transcend into our youth, and people signing up to go to war, and we carry these archetypes, these messianic archetypes in particular, with us through our life, because I think most of these fantasies and these stories really are founded in a biblical truth and a biblical story narrative, and that have become what they are in different variations.
Well, and I think that one thing that kind of points back to, we've discussed about like this struggle between good and evil, and good being the ultimate victor. I think that something that can kind of point us to, like, our desire to see that happen is evidence of our desire to see that happen in eternity, like in this world, like our evidence of as believers for that day to come where Christ is the ultimate victor, and like we're living in this ultimate utopia with him, and so anything that like ticks that deep longing inside of us to see that come about, to see that ultimate victory from good come about, I think it offers even more appeal as well. So that's why these things can be 5, 6, 10 books long, and we're still there because we have to see the ultimate win, the ultimate good.
Got to see it. Got to close it out.
Yeah, yep. We have to. And that's, I think that speaks to our desire, again, to see that happen in the spiritual realm, the ultimate victory of Christ.
And that's part of the reason it was years ago. I don't remember when the last season came out of Game of Thrones. I did not like that story, bothered me so much. I refused to read the books because there was just no justice. Nobody got what they deserved. never turned out the way I wanted it to turn. And it broke all the storylines that I appreciate. And it was one of those series that I didn't really enjoy because it didn't follow the narrative that I yearned for. It was just totally unfair all the time. Nothing made sense.
That's a good example for sure.
There's an article also called like, does the genre of fantasy belong within Christianity? And I find it really interesting because Dr. Hatch is the one who like was writing this article. Talks a little bit about medieval literature into fantasy. So she says here, like a lot of medieval literature which influences fantasy is deeply Christian because that was their entire worldview. It would have been unthinkable for them to have a different worldview other than the Christian one. And again, medieval like Tolkien and Lewis were medieval scholars. And if you're looking at the origins of any sort of genre, what did the originators, what were they influenced by? And like, that is what they were influenced by. And so maybe individuals fall to realize just how, interwoven Christianity has been with fantasy from the very beginning. And like we were saying, like it's interwoven even throughout all of it. So it began within fantasy and kind of spread into really every other genre that we see, especially within Marvel and DC and any other like saga that just kind of comes up, or new fantasy shows or movies that pop up on Netflix, Disney, whatever. And so especially even within comics, man, I feel like there's so many moments where if you watched, the recent Guardians of the Galaxy, this is spoilers. So you maybe not spoilers. Karen, are you going to watch Guardians? Have you seen Guardians yet? Third one?
I'm actually working my way through the Marvel series, so I haven't hit Guardians yet.
All right. Well, I won't spoil it for you. But, there's a lot of characters, even within the recent Guardians, like the main villain who just, you see a lot of kind of that complex. There's a lot of symbolism throughout a lot of the movies that people use within movies. Even the recent Shazam, you see it's called Fury of the Gods. And so, and then even in Guardians, you have Adam Warlock, and for Adam, the first human kind of thing, so there's so many of all of that interwoven within it. And so even kind of a little bit going back to like, the question, have we become obsessed with that idea of that kingdom, or, kind of like how do we, I guess the question I'm really asking is, now that we know, or we recognize that we have become maybe obsessed with the idea of just escaping our reality. It might not even be in fantasy. It could be in anything and just escaping. But how do we manage that? What is the best boundary that we can do, even as Christians? Because that's a lot for us as well. We're, first and foremost, God is first. We put him first over everything else. And so what are the best ways that we can recognize when we start to become obsessed with in fantasy or within really anything else which is around us?
I and I was talking to Annie and actually a few others, this topic came up quite a bit in my life over the past couple of months. Little bit of my story, when I got clean, and it was next month will be 7 years off of all substances. Thank you. And when that happened, I was sold on the idea that there must be something better to replace this addiction with. Because I was really seeking out a different reality and accepting my reality and leaning into community, leaning into relationships, and getting support in everything that I needed that I was missing. Because when I got clean, I was still left with the same problems that I started with, and I was still left with the same yearning. And especially when I really got heavily involved with the church, I found a sense of purpose. I had community and support, and I was able to serve. And you would think that would satiate all of my desires, right? You would think that would be the answer. And to an extent it was, because I no longer have any compulsion or any desire to modify to the extent of drug use, at least. I still indulge in fantasy and food and things of that nature. But my soul is not satiated to the heavenly degree that I want it to be. And after a lot of conversation, it's gotten to almost a point of frustration for me where where I was like, well, what else is missing? Right. And the more I talk to Christians specifically, they're like, that somebody said something that was so profound. They're like, hey, that is supposed to be there. Like, that is supposed to be present. We are supposed to yearn for a life after this one. And it's a manageable desire to where I can still live and enjoy my life. But I also get to look forward when, just the other day, my back flared up. I had something that inhibited me from, going out and doing what I wanted to do and playing ultimate Frisbee and all that. And I was a little frustrated by it. And I had the peace to say, this is not my only body, because I have a lot of fear about like tearing up my back too young or getting hurt or something like that. And I have that peace. And then when things are falling apart and they're not fitting the way I want, I get to remind myself, this is not the only life that I have. And I guess I guess what I'm saying is that we're supposed to yearn and look forward to that and be expectant of that. And, I don't know if that directly,
that faraway kingdom, being
exactly
the kingdom of God,
the kingdom of God. And so it's not just a destination. It's the entire experience that we get to have. It's the new body. It's the new relationships. It's the removal of pain, hurt, fear, all of those things that we get to look forward to. But I think without that direction here on earth, we'll start to create our own kingdom, our own fantasy that's far away, that has a secular twist, and lose sight of what we actually get to look forward to.
It's so good.
It's good.
So good. It's so good.
Like, all right, we're done. That's the end of the episode, guys. We have answered the question,
it was a personal one. I'm really glad this topic got brought up because it's really been on my heart.
Yeah. I think that's something I always have to like watch. I think that's something that and I think it's really for anyone who have moments of stress, anxiety, or whatever, you immediately, like, a lot of my reaction, like, hey, let's just go watch a movie. Let's watch a movie. Let's put on a TV show. I don't want to think about it. It's my initial reaction. Usually my fleshly reaction is to do that, is to watch, put on a movie, put on a show, or like let's focus on this one project, or let's just work on a costume. Let's just like plan my next campaign for D&D or whatever it is. It's escaping into that. And many times I'm like, let's rewatch, any Lord of the Rings, let's rewatch this or whatever. I think that's something that I know for me that I have to really watch. And it's so funny because even Annie, like what, we talked about like the Disney princesses, like, man, I think that even is a huge part of just, why I am the way I am. Why, really like I became obsessed with all that. But I think it's just learning, kind of like Karen, what you're saying, it's just like, not exactly going into these faraway kingdoms, but it's focusing on the kingdom of God. It's focusing on him and going to him first and going and expecting, like, hey, even though it's hard right now, it's going to be okay. And I think it's, and even for me, like I have to learn even to sit in that too, because I can escape it immediately with something else and distract myself. I'm very good at distracting myself. And so I'll go to something else versus just sitting with God and just letting him heal me, or letting him be the one that eases all of my anxiety that I'm feeling in that moment, and I think that's really just all of us, any of us. It may not even be a TV show or whatever. It can be whatever your fantasy is, or whatever it is, that sin or whatever that we immediately gravitate towards. So it's really learning to do that within fantasy. But what's even interesting, for those who want to jump into fantasy, or like you love fantasy and you're trying to figure out maybe, what is that good balance between both? Is there a good way to do this, or, there's other options as well. So not really changing subjects, but I mean, still within the same subject. So for those who play D&D, you may not be comfortable, or maybe you're looking for another, not exactly escape, but, another outlet. There's always Christian versions of it. I always say that. There's the Adventurer's Guide to the Bible for Dungeons and Dragons.
No kidding.
And it's a 5th edition one. It is. And you actually are in biblical times, right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, but you're in another city, another area, but you're hearing all that's happening and you're dealing with Roman government, all kind of stuff. And then there's the Bible video game that's also out, that's going to come out next year. But I don't know. I think that's for fantasy. I think it's learning how to draw that line.
But Mary, I think this is like a really important conversation that all Christians really should have, because fantasy is intertwined in so many areas of our life. And, Annie, you brought up like pornography, for example, at the beginning of the podcast. And, this is something that our church, and I'm proud of our church for talking about this and addressing it a lot. And typically it's targeted at men, and a lot of women experience something similar. But one thing to point out that I've learned, especially about pornography and lust, is how intertwined they are with fantasy. And men are very visual creatures. And so a lot of the time our Achilles heel is pornography, because it's a visual representation of the fantasy we have in our mind. And you guys mentioned the Disney princess narrative.
It's what we desire.
It's that, yeah. And so many women, especially in church, that I've heard have these fantasies about the man and the house and the kids and the white picket fence. And these fantasies are becoming lust on repeat over and over and over again of kind of this desired outcome and this desired fantasy. So I do think it's an important conversation for all of us to have. When do we leave hope for the future, and when do we start to step into a lustful fantasy about a different future?
And I think that it's so interesting, because that's always been, I think, what we've all been always, been towards is like, hey, dream of your future, dream of what you want, you do you. And so I think many times when that doesn't exactly happen, we begin to fantasize of what our life could be, or what our life or what we want our life to look like, or who we want with us, or whatever that is. Man, and that could be such a dangerous kind of mindset to even be put in. I think there's so many of us who have been through that,
But I mean, thank God for the break that we get, occasionally throughout a week, to pick up a novel, to watch a show. It's like sometimes we just need 20, 30 minutes, to stop thinking about the rhythm and the routine, and to give our mind a break and explore our imagination. So I do have an appreciation.
And it's great to read these books. Yeah. It's great to do all this, because it's a good balance. Like, we're not here saying all of this is bad and you can't watch any fantasy. Like, no, I mean, this is called the Nerds and Jesus podcast for a reason. But, it's learning to merge both in a beautiful way. And, a little bit of escapism is not bad. It's okay to, like, you know what, I'm just going to watch this over 20 minutes, or, just dive into your favorite book series and that you just love. You always need to have like a fun book to read, or a fun show you're watching too. But learning also your boundaries. If there's something that just triggers you, or something that's you don't feel, you feel oh my gosh, the word convicted about. Yeah. So it's understanding that, because every Christian will have their own convictions of what type of entertainment they're going to watch. They might not be more of the Harry Potter world, but they can dive into a different series or whatever. And I think it's learning to recognize that as and I think fantasy is probably one of the safer genres for like a healthy form of escapism, probably. But yeah. So, but is there I know we're coming towards the end of the episode, but is there anything else that y'all wanted to share within fantasy, or hot take, or anything like that?
No, we covered a lot of ground.
We did.
I know. Sweet. But appreciate y'all. Thank you so much for being on this episode. I'm sure it won't be the last, but thankful that we're able to just even like talk about this, because we've touched some of this on some other episodes, and I think it's always going to tie into anything we're going to have on an episode. We're always going to tie it back to like, hey, making sure, even though we're consuming all this content, but assuring that we're also, consuming the Bible even more. It's double it. If we're reading all these books, make sure you're reading the word even more. It's, it's not the other way around where, you're reading the Bible, but you've finished like a whole book series in like 3 days. So it's learning how to, because that's me.
Never done that. No, never done that.
I remember like in high school, I would like, I wish I could say I'm a book reader. I have a lot of books. I am a book collector. Not much of a book. I mean, I have the books. Okay. I'm really bad at finishing them. I have ADHD. So I'll get like third of the way. I'm like, oh, what's this book over here? And then I'll like dive into that book. But TV shows and movies is a different thing for me because I'm able to concentrate. But yeah, I think it's just learning how to having that fun book that you can read. So yeah.
Good.
I totally forgot what I was saying. I lost my train of thought.
What did you say? Something about ADHD or something?
I forgot what I was saying.
I think that was the topic we were on.
I was talking and completely forgot what I was talking about. That's an example of that.
Case
right
in
there.
point.
If you listen to my other episodes, sometimes I'm rambling. I'm like, I forgot what I was talking about. I'm gonna end the sentence right here.
Well, at one point in that last little bit, you thanked us for being here. So we're really
thank you for being on this episode.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Appreciate y'all.
It's fun.
Yeah, and so cool. Is there any? I don't know if y'all are folks who like people following you on social media.
Sure.
I don't think Kerrigan, you have social media, but if y'all want to, share your social media handle or a random hot take on anything you'd like. We've had other guests say that boneless chicken wings isn't chicken wings. And so, different random hot takes like that if you want to share.
That's fair.
Before we leave.
That's fair. I don't know that I have a hot take. Kerrigan, do you have a hot take?
Only eat grass-fed beef. Grain-fed is not good for you.
Yeah, I don't have a hot take, but I'm happy to have people follow me on social. I'm most active on Instagram, Annie Mayberry. Come find me.
Nice.
You can follow my foster parent journey.
I know. I love that. But seriously, y'all need to follow her because they're beautiful stories and all the things. So awesome. All right. Well, thank y'all so much for jumping on this episode. And for the rest of our listeners, we'll see y'all next week. Hey, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Nerds and Jesus podcast. This podcast is produced, edited, created, and hosted by me, Mary Howell. I also run our social media and Patreon page and also did our art. The music is by John Bjork. And if you're looking for a way to get connected into the Nerds and Jesus podcast community, you can follow us on social media at Nerds and Jesus. And for more bonus content, physical merch, and so much more, you can visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/nerdsandjesus. You can also become a producer level patron as a supreme nerd, where you will get your name read at the end of every episode as well. If you would like to continue to support the show, you can share this podcast word of mouth with everyone you know. You can also review and rate our episode wherever you get your podcast. Anything helps, and thank you so much for listening to this episode. See y'all next week.